Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Can countries actually stop each other from advancing technologically? This is one of the defining strategic questions of our time. And in today's episode, we explore exactly that. I'm Shreya and I'm joined by my colleague Arindam to discuss his latest discussion document on technology denial regimes. In it, he grapples with some of the defining questions in contemporary great power competition. What actually determines whether a technology blockade succeeds or fails? What happens when global supply chains are weaponized? How countries respond when they cut off from critical technologies, whether the tools of tech wars have evolved beyond traditional export controls, and in the case of fast-moving knowledge technologies like AI, whether containment is even realistic. Ultimately, where is all of this headed? We link the discussion document in the show notes. Please do give it a read. So, Arindam, let me start by asking, what made you take up this topic now?
Yeah, I guess in today's world where we are seeing a lot of these tech wars, where technology has become central to a national ambition, to geopolitics, we see a lot of technology denial regimes in play. We have seen that in the semiconductor sector, with the US coming up with various methodologies to block technology transfer to China in the form of entity lists. Even their AI action plan sort of puts out a strategy of having the world follow the US AI stack, AI standards, etc. Right? In that sense, this was the starting point. We wanted to analyze how do these technology denial regimes work so that we can understand what would be the trajectory of the technology denial regimes as far as AI and semiconductors is concerned. So that was the trigger point, and we thought it would be very instructive to first study the technology denial regimes of the past in the fields of nuclear tech, space tech, defense tech, etc., and then use the learnings from there to apply them to these new sectors of AI and semiconductors, but also be conscious of the fact that some of the learnings may not really apply to AI and semiconductors because the world has changed, the technologies have changed, the space at which these technologies work or adapt or keep changing, that itself has changed. So that was why this idea came.
I see. How interesting. So you've studied case studies from the past to examine questions that are so timely right now with some of these sectors globally, but also you're finding that some of these situations may not be relevant anymore. What were some of the lessons that stood out for you from these past case studies? Like from your paper, we can see, and like what you just mentioned, you looked at nuclear non-proliferation, space technology, sanctions in supercomputing, etc. So how have things stood out for you in that things have changed and we're not in the same kind of a geopolitical space right now? And how have things stayed the same?
Right. I think the nuclear case is probably the most instructive and also probably the most humbling for countries that, impose these regimes. So just to give some background, the nuclear suppliers group that we generally talk about when it comes to nuclear tech denial regimes, along with the NPT, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, etc., that NSG was created in direct reaction to India's 1974 nuclear test. It was very deceptively called the Smiling Buddha. But there, the main point was India used plutonium from a Canadian research reactor and heavy water from the US. And both of them were supplied for ostensibly peaceful purposes, right? But we used them to build a bomb and then we tested it.
Right.
So the first lesson is almost like embarrassingly simple, right? And that being denial regimes are almost always reactive rather than anticipate. So sort of like the horse is already out there before anyone thinks to, close the door, close the bar door. Right? Sure. But the deeper lesson is about what happens when a determined country with genuine scientific capacity simply decides that it will not be stopped. Just look at India. India spent decades building out the entire nuclear fuel cycle from scratch after these denial regimes kicked into force, right?
Yeah.
Right from uranium enrichment to heavy water production, reactor design, fuel fabrication, etc. Right? And it came at enormous cost and opportunity, but it worked, right? By 2008, the US essentially acknowledged that it worked by signing the civil nuclear agreement with us. It brought back India into civilian nuclear commerce, but interestingly, we never signed the non-proliferation treaty. So the regime, in fact, if you see, in effect, it didn't stop India. It just made India's path longer and more expensive. And then eventually the regime itself had to accommodate the reality India had sort of created. There's another very instructive story called the COCOM story, right? So the Coordinating Committee for Multilateral Export Controls, in short, it's called COCOM, COCOM. And
Right.
this started in 1949, I think, and it ran till 1994. It was one of the longest technology denial regimes that have ever been attempted. Now, what's remarkable about this is it effectively slid through all the four quadrants that I have in my strategic effectiveness framework, right? So in the early Cold War years, it genuinely functioned as what the paper calls an iron gate, right? Where Western nations dominated advanced manufacturing. They had ideological unity among themselves that was strong. The controls really had to bite, right? But by the 1970s and 1980s, the detent had really softened. Threat perceptions, economic interests had also diverged, right? So that then it degraded to something closer to a fragile monopoly, where the monopoly was there, but it was not really, out of free will, right? And then effectively you see that it dissolved in 1994. So it was essentially a paper wall. So it was basically a gentleman's agreement with no legal force, no enforcement mechanism. And if you look at it, it didn't have even headquarters beyond a room in the US embassy annex in Paris, right? So it operated in secrecy. People didn't know it existed for quite a long time. And the structural informality itself proved fatal, because there's a scandal that happened when it came to this COCOM export control regime, whereby the French actually sold 10 machines that were similar, that had some, that were subject to these export control regimes, but they sold it to the Soviets, but they didn't face any consequences. So that was a sort of a moral hazard that gets created. So that's a sort of fragile coalition that you generally have when it comes to export control regimes, because there's domestic pressures. Why domestic pressures? Because your domestic producers are affected when you effectively tell them that a particular export market is out of reach for them. That's a huge revenue loss for them, and they would lobby for those export control regimes to be taken off. So that's one thing to note, that if you have such a long running export control regime, it's bound to fail if you don't have feedback mechanisms put into the entire process. Feedback mechanisms looking at whether the country that you are targeting is developing its own internal capabilities. Is it developing alternative partnerships? Is it getting those technologies from somewhere else? There could be indicators like what sort of patents it is developing, what sort of technologies it is developing, what sort of partnerships it is trying to attempt. And those feedback mechanisms, if you don't plug it back into your export control regime, then it's bound to fail. If you're not going to adjust your technology denial regime with some financial incentives here and there to bring them to the bargaining table, then it's going to fail. And I think the last one that I would like to talk about is the space technology case, right? Because that gives something genuinely optimistic for us to consider. So when ISRO was cut off from key propulsion and launch technologies under the missile technology control regime, it didn't simply replicate what it was denied, right? It innovated. It had constraints, but through that constraints, it eventually developed low-cost satellite launch capabilities that are now like competing globally. So that's disruption in action, right? The constraint itself became the innovation driver, so as to say.
Yeah, so there are definite opportunities for countries that have been imposed on, and also for imposing countries, right? Like you said, if they are set on one path of export controls without reassessing, that is definitely a risk. But what are some really difficult trade-offs which are likely in any tech war of this nature? There are trade-offs for both imposing countries and countries on the receiving end of these denial controls.
So yeah, I think for the imposing country, the cruelest trade-off is that the very act of imposing a blockade starts a clock that's ticking against you, and that's brutally asymmetric for the imposing country. So just to give an example, let's consider the Toshiba Kongsberg scandal of the 1980s. That was probably one of the most dramatic illustrations of this asymmetry in the Cold War history. So basically, the scandal is this: that between 1982 and 1984, there's this company, Toshiba Machine Company, in I think Japan, and there's a company in Norway. These were selling advanced milling machines to the Soviet Union, and the cost was around $17 million, right? And these machines could help you carve submarine propeller blades to much better tolerances. They would make the submarines less noisy, and that would help them become less detectable. Now, for detection, range itself collapses, right? But for the US, what that meant that it would cost $30 billion to develop new detection systems. They would need to build additional nuclear submarines to compensate. So you look at the strategic disadvantage of $17 million and $30 billion, right? So it's really a ratio of what, 2000 to 1. So that is the trade-off that the imposing country never fully prices in. That's the cost of enforcement failure, which is always going to be there. It's not just about losing the technology race; it's about paying once you have lost that technology race, or you have or the targeted country finds out a loophole. You are really paying an almost unimaginable multiple to compensate for that gap. Then there's the other trade-off, which is really the domestic political trade-off. So if you look at it, when the Toshiba scandal itself broke, U.S. congressmen literally smashed Toshiba radios and televisions on the White House lawn. But the anger doesn't sustain the regime, right? It's when your economic incentives are really aligned. Look at now when we have the Western semiconductor firms that are already bleeding real revenue from the restrictions that they have to face in the Chinese market. So public choice economics, as I've written in the paper also, the public choice economics tells us that concentrated industrial interests will usually outlast national security concerns, which are diffuse in nature, right? So in the policy arena, that will always trump national security concerns, especially if the strategic advantages of denial become less visible while the economic costs become more so, right? Now, coming to the targeted country, the trade-off is almost the inverse, right? It's basically a brutal, what do you call it, short-term tax that you have to pay in exchange for long-term sovereignty. Look at the Chincom case, which was basically one subset of the COCOM export control regime. It was basically a harsher embargo that the US had imposed on China. But that was purely punitive because it was imposed on China because it entered the Korean War in 1950. So what happened was the US-China trade collapsed. It was around, if I'm not wrong, $60 million in 1949. From there, it collapsed to just about $100,000 by 1952. That's like a 99% collapse in 2 years. China obviously suffered, but that embargo pushed China directly into the Soviet Union's arms, right? The Soviet Union responded at that time with one of the most significant technology transfers in modern history. They had like multiple industrial projects, blueprints, training programs, Russian, like Soviet scientists training Chinese scientists, etc. And China absorbed all of it. Now, it's good that they absorbed all of it, because then there was a Sino-Soviet split that came in 1960, and that support, like within a very small time, that support itself evaporated. So China, but by that time, had developed enough of a technological foundation, enough of R&D capabilities to go it alone. So effectively, they developed the nuclear weapons by 1964, just like 14 years after the embargo began. So the targeted countries trade-off then is that you accept years of genuine pain. You trust that the institutional capacity that you are building during this period will eventually make the denial regime irrelevant. Now, whether that faith is well placed depends on obviously how much infrastructure you actually start with, how much scientific infrastructure you start with, and what and how that helps you speed up the process. But that's that a short-term pain that you have to tolerate to get that long-term sovereignty benefits.
Yeah. Speaking about infrastructure and the state of current scientific institutions, right? To even decide how much time it takes for you to catch up with an imposing country, for example. Do you think what has been the case for the last 70, 80 years, where we're building foundational technological capabilities, do you think that applies today as well in today's world of rapid diffusion, so to speak?
Yes, I think. I mean, as I just talked about the Chincom story where the Chinese developed that capacity, you see that same thing happening now in the AI, in the semiconductor sector also, right? Just look at how China has responded to semiconductor controls. These controls were like very specifically and very brazenly designed to deny China access to leading edge chip manufacturing machines, right? Particularly the Netherlands-based ASML's EUV lithography machines. So that's like one of the most critical choke points in the entire semiconductor supply chain. If China can't get those machines, what does China do? It's pouring resources firstly into developing its own domestic capabilities in this field, but it is also doing what I have talked about in the paper as leapfrogging paradigm, right? So it's pouring resources into technologies that might seem right now to be too far-fetched into the future, like neuromorphic computing, photonic processors, quantum architectures, etc. Right? But it is doing that in the hope that these things will render these silicon-based manufacturing constraints totally irrelevant. Now, the irony is that the US may have unwittingly used its own choke points or its own controls in a way that will catalyze the very technologies that make these choke points obsolete. And the US probably would get left out. I mean, I'm not saying it will get left out because the US has a very vibrant R&D ecosystem, etc. But this will surely help China gain that strategic reversal. And one of the important data points that we need to consider is that in the case of AI, it is along with the compute and data layers, etc. It is also to a large extent, it's also about algorithms, right? And once you have algorithms, we'll talk about it later on, that algorithms are not in the same nature of physical hardware based technology controls, right? And within the software field, you also have that open source software, open data, open weights frameworks that we have, right? So a recent data point will make this like very, very sharp, right? If you remember, there was this thing in 2023 when Meta released the weights of its Llama Gen AI model, right? It made it public. So basically, anybody who has an internet connection and a basic hardware can, host this open weight model and then, run its inferences, etc. So this single decision by one private American company, and this has effectively what has it done? It has undermined a significant piece of the US government's AI containment strategy. If you look at its AI action plan, etc., these are the things that will undermine that strategy. So no export control regime can be designed to handle this. So that's some of the trade-offs there, not trade-offs, the strategic reversal capabilities or possibilities that you'll see when it comes to these technology denial regimes in today's world.
Yeah, so you're also saying that the idea of this strategic reversal that you brought up in your paper as well, and how it ironically ends up biting a rival country because, a country that's been imposed laws has probably leapfrogged and sort of changed the game altogether. This could also happen more and more as we go in the future, right?
Yeah, I mean, so these are things that are always evolving, right? And you will see the nature of these things changing, especially in the technologies that we are talking about right now. These are technologies that evolve at a very fast pace. These involve trade-offs because right now we have a supply chain that is highly distributed. You don't have, so if you look at my paper, I have this framework where I look at the extent of supply chain control and the extent of multilateral cooperation that imposing country can conjure up. Right now, if you look at it, the supply chain control is very difficult to get in today's world because of the globalization decades of 1990s and early 2000s, maybe even a little bit of the early 2010s. Right, you have a diffuse supply chain, which then leads to multiple choke points, which then leads to control not in the hands of one particular country. And in the absence of that supply chain control, to get multiple countries to align with you, to forsake their economic interests, to forsake their energy interests, etc., to come together with you to impose these technology denial regimes, that's going to be difficult in today's world.
Yeah, you also talk about how bifurcation hence cannot be avoided. It is, it's obviously going to happen.
Yeah, I mean, so I have talked about this concept of weaponized interdependence, right? So what happens is, if I can just explain this idea, this will then take us to how there will be bifurcation of the entire ecosystem into different pathways, different technologies, different supply chains, right? So weaponized interdependence is an idea that global networks, it could be financial systems, supply chains, the internet infrastructure that we have, these are all not like one neutral sort of plumbing system which is not affected by geopolitics, etc. It is affected by geopolitics. The entities who are sitting at the choke points in these networks, they have their own incentives to coerce others. They are in the structural position to coerce others. The clearest example is SWIFT, right? It's the SWIFT payment mechanism that we have, right? It's basically a Belgian cooperative that routes payment messages between banks globally. So you saw this being used when Iran Iran was disconnected from SWIFT in 2012. It lost the bulk of its oil revenue very quickly. Russian banks were disconnected after the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. The financial shock there also was pretty immediate and severe.
Yeah.
These actions weren't export controls in the traditional sense, right? I mean, there was no specific technology that was denied, but what was denied was access to this entire system of global commerce itself. So now, in semiconductors, there's the equivalent of Swift that is there, which is absurdly concentrated. ASML, right? The example that I talked about, they are sort of the only company. They are the company that makes the only machines in the world capable of manufacturing the most advanced chips. So that's a choke point that has remarkable strategic leverage. The US, what the US has done, it has coordinated with the Netherlands and then Japan, South Korea, etc., to weaponize this choke point, along with other choke points when it comes to memory chips, etc. Right. So here's where this weaponized interdependence concept that comes very handy here, right? If you use these network positions coercively, it will fragment the very networks that gave you the power. So what will happen is countries on the receiving end, they won't just sit still, right? They would build alternatives. And once those alternatives exist, your structural leverage will go. So what are those alternatives that will get built? China, for example, will go. You'll see things happening like the DeepSeek moment, where there was optimization at the software level itself, right, at the algorithm level. Then you will have research go into how to make more efficient chips, how to make chips that are much more efficient in terms of power consumption, right? So those sorts of bifurcations will happen.
They could also create their own ecosystems.
They could have their own ecosystem. So one of the asymmetric mechanisms that I've talked about in the paper is, standards setting, right? So we think of when it comes to standards, we think of them to be very nerdy technical things that are devoid of geopolitics. But you see a lot of geopolitics happening when it comes to standard settings, right? So what will happen is states that will have significant membership in international standards making bodies will then insert their requirements which are beneficial to their technologies, and that will come at the expense of the competition, right? So then it is especially effective if you're doing it for nascent technologies where standards have not yet been developed, they're still in flux. So if you see this really happening in the Chinese attempts to set the standards when it comes to 5G, right, through bodies such as 3GPP. It has for a long time been, I think, lobbying to get the ITU, International Television Union's presidency, if I'm not wrong. So you get early into the standard setting and you can really build competitive advantages, which then, even if you don't explicitly call this technology denial, it is de facto a technology denial barrier, right, against people who move late. So in that sense, this is very important. You saw that in the COCOM case also, right? The COCOM case, what happened was, at its peak, it was genuinely controlling the choke points. Western nations dominated precision manufacturing, electronics, advanced electronics, even aerospace technology, defense technology, etc. Right? But slowly the technology diffused, right? Other countries developed capabilities. Then the multilateral cooperation that bolstered this technology denial regime, it eroded by the time when it came to the 1980s, when anyway the Cold War was sort of waning. The economic incentives had shifted. So all of this structural leverage that they had a shelf life, and which is now you see this in a reverse manner happening nowadays, right? You see that China is now deploying its own versions of technology denial. It has, for example, restricted gallium, germanium, and other rare earth exports to the US and its allies. It did it with Japan also, when in the 2010, I think, when there was the Senkaku Island wala crisis. So, and it is right now sitting on 60% of the world's gallium production, and I think 80% of germanium production, right? So it's weaponizing its own choke points. So it has basically created what I call a mutual vulnerability situation, right, where both sides are simultaneously imposing and targeted countries. So this is now the new strategic environment that we find ourselves in, that Cold War and our denial frameworks will never be able to handle.
We've gone beyond mere export controls, right? Were there any other asymmetric strategic weapons that were more covert, more sly, that you discovered while researching for this discussion document?
Right. So when we think of a technology war, we generally have this conventional image of export control lists, licensing regimes, maybe customs enforcement, etc. So these are all bureaucratic machineries. But the most consequential weapons that will get deployed now or have been also deployed earlier actually operate beneath this radar, right? For example, look at what the Soviet KGB ran in the early 1980s. It had a systematic industrial scale program of technology intelligence collection, right? It targeted Western firms. They weren't trying to buy their way out of, COCOM's controls. They were simply stealing, right? China is also accused of the same, right? So this is the oldest asymmetric play. If the front door is locked, you use the window, right? But now, what's different today is the scale, the sophistication, and the fact that the window that you have to get into these asymmetric mechanisms is increasingly digital. I've talked about it in the paper. I've given the example of the 2020 solar winds attack, right? What happened then was that malicious actors, they inserted a surveillance capability directly into IT management software that was widely used, deployed on multiple servers, multiple companies, etc. Right? So you no longer need to move physical objects across borders to penetrate a technology supply chain. And when you think of the supply chains, we only think of generally the manufacturing part, right? But if you look at it end to end, it is up till the deployment and the post deployment phases also, right? So you just need that access to the software. So you could probably have monitoring systems that could be deployed not just for espionage, right? You could also do it for denial enforcement. So you have these ideas that are being explored about hardware backdoors, etc., right? So you have all of that you can do. But you can use these monitoring systems to track whether circumvention is being attempted, whether alternative sourcing has happened, whether the supply chains have been restructured. So that's a new capability that we have. Then there's also the financial system that I just talked about, the SWIFT system also, right? Now, we had these capabilities for a long time, but if you look at it, I mean, SWIFT, for example, has been there for quite a while, and it has been used, as I mentioned, going back way to 2012, right, when Iran was disconnected. But now there's another way of using this financial plumbing as a choke point. And that's a very interesting thing. So if you look at, for example, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, the CFIUS, right? It operates with a similar logic of cutting off things at the financial level, but it does it very quietly, right? So what it basically does is it can review minority stakes, joint ventures, mergers, and M&As, right? Basically, it need not be just full acquisitions. Also, it can just be some foreign company taking a minority stake. All of that, right? So it is one of the most effective technology denial tools that the US has. China also has, something similar that it has started using nowadays to an increasing degree. It's called the SAM, or the State Administration on Market Regulations. Effectively, any merger that is happening, which has a huge revenue market or revenue impact or a market in China, has to be approved by China for that merged entity to work, to be allowed to work in China, right? So now China is one of the biggest markets for a merger to be blocked on this, and there are multiple examples of that. The Broadcom example, then there was some more examples that I forget now, but there are multiple such examples. So that's the sort of financial mechanisms that are being used, the new financial mechanisms that are being used. Obviously, there are the other examples which are not really financial but could fall into that, where you are restricting exports of rare earths, right? Like China is doing, right? So that is again something which will help. But now, interestingly, because Japan had strong R&D capacity, it immediately kicked in, and it started developing recycling methods and alternative materials, right, that could reduce the dependence, and it really achieved that. So there's obviously that strategic reversal that we talked about earlier. Then obviously there are these standards bodies that we just talked about, so I'll not go into that again. That's another sort of asymmetric mechanism that you have.
Talent mobility is
Talent
one.
mobility, yeah, talent mobility is one more thing, right? So I mean, ironically, the US is dismantling that by all these immigration restrictions that it is imposing, and it might help India and other countries if we latch onto latch onto this opportunity. China has done that to a very successful. It has done it very successfully through its 1,000 talents program, etc. We also have programs like Vajra and all of that, but we need to pull this talent that is suffering there, we could provide them, generous research funding, etc., etc. So that talent dimension is very important. And lastly, I think there's the information warfare and cognitive domain thing that I've talked about in my paper.
I was going to ask,
So
yes.
so you look at the 5G security debate, right? Now, whether or not Huawei equipment actually poses specific security risks that are demonstrable, right? And whether those risks are beyond what are posed by other vendors, that's the question that security researchers obviously will keep debating. But the geopolitics at the core of it is that why is Huawei being targeted while when these same risks could be posed by other vendors also? Now, it's about the China tech war, right? The US China tech war, right? So now you see what's happening with the information campaign around this question. There are coordinated communications about Chinese backdoors, whether or not they exist. That's not been proven yet. Then there's pressure on allies to exclude Huawei. It's like a civilizational security question, right? The framing of 5G. So all of this is shaping adoption decisions across multiple countries in a way that has proven more effective than any formal export control, right? But China obviously has also become adept at deploying its own information operations that complicate these narratives, right? It creates doubt about the security of Western platforms itself. It amplifies stories about surveillance, capitalism, etc. Right? It has through the standards route, it has tried to position its own technological ecosystem as an alternative to a US dominated spying or surveillance sort of internet that you generally talk about, it, where big tech is trying to access all your data, etc. Right? I mean, nobody believes that Chinese companies will not do that, but that's an alternative theory that they try to put out, right? So those sorts of information warfare based, cognitive manipulation based techniques that can also help in fragmenting coalitions. It will create a space for alternative standards to take hold, and then it will slow down the adoption of these technology denial regimes.
Arindam, how fascinating, right? But one of the sort of questions I wanted to end with, but also hear your take on, was for a policy wonk based out of India, if they want to read more about technology denial and what that means for India, apart from your discussion document, where would you point them to? And what are your thoughts on that?
Right. I think it is very instructive to look at how, read up about how India navigated the space technology denial regime, the nuclear tech denial regime. There's some reading material that I recently shared about. I'll share that with you. You can maybe link it from the show notes where it talked about the evolution of nuclear tech denial regime and when it came to India, right? So India is, I think, the most interesting actor in this whole landscape, precisely because it has been, how do we put it? It has been educated by constraint in a way that almost no other major power has been, right? India has been on the receiving end of technology denial across nuclear, space, supercomputing, defense sectors, etc. And quite often these have been like simultaneously applied to India. Now, across all these cases, India's response has obviously multiple facets, but one thing that has been consistent, that we have sort of invested in indigenous capabilities, at least in those sectors, right? I'm not saying India's research R&D capabilities are very good. I mean, we are still lagging. We are still lagging in a lot of other sectors, but at least in the space sector, in the nuclear tech sector, we have built somewhat of a foundation where we have eventually achieved some semblance of technological sovereignty, right? So, my paper, for example, places India in what I call the resilient transformer quadrant, where India has been able to combine high indigenous R&D capability with selectively formed alternative partnerships. Now that's a hard one position, right? It requires a lot of diplomacy also, right? So it's not just technical work, it's also diplomacy. But you don't get to this quadrant without having spent decades as the determined innovator, right? Where you're mostly going it alone. You don't have alternative partnerships, not because those countries don't want to come into partnership with you, but because they are also scared of these export control regimes. Like Russia and the cryogenic engine case, right? I mean, there was literally a tangential on which this cryogenic engine was denied to India.
Do you see that changing? Do you see countries on the receiving end more bolder to form coalitions now in today's day and age?
Yes, because I think, as I said, the supply chains that form the foundation of all these technologies are such diffuse, right? Except maybe some choke points, as I talked about the ASML, EUV thing and all. But even there, you see China trying to develop alternatives, right? And see, as long as there was no technology denial regime in place, there was no pressure. Everybody was fine with just having one Netherlands-based company, supplying. So nobody talked about that in terms of being a choke point, right? But now there's this concept of creative insecurity, right? That Zachary Taylor had talked about, right? Where you see what happens is a lot of in R&D, a lot of innovation happens when external hazards overwhelm domestic dissensions. So if the external hazard which is now very obvious when it comes to these technology denial in terms of these tech wars and technology denial regimes in the AI and semiconductor field, these external hazards have like totally overwhelmed any domestic disputes. That in China probably you don't have that, a lot of that domestic dissension. You have a centralized sort of polity that can really coalesce and build coalitions within to target a problem. But if that is something that affects even India, I think even in India we see a lot of R&D being pushed in these sectors, right? So that creative insecurity kicks in, and it is nowadays easier to do this sort of R&D, especially in the AI fields, in generative AI, etc. Because a lot of it is at the algorithmic layer, right? It's a lot of it is at the data layer, which you can probably have. The infrastructure is something that you try to put technology denial regimes on. You try to control what sort of data centers you can build, what sort of chips you can put in your data centers. But even then, I think that infrastructure nowadays would get commoditized to a large extent, especially with open source alternatives and all. And therefore, it will be difficult to prevent countries from building their own alternatives, building their own alternative partnerships, and then trying to circumvent these technology denial regimes. And the more complicated the supply chain, the more difficult it is for the imposing country to enforce it, right? It's going to be very difficult for, say, the United States to find out whether its chips are reaching China either directly or through other countries. We are seeing this in action, right? There are alternative business models that are evolving, where Chinese companies are setting up front companies in the Southeast Asian nations, in Singapore, etc., and then they are buying chips. Those companies are buying it, setting up their data centers, but they are servicing Chinese companies, which again are headquartered in Singapore, etc. So there's ways to circumvent it, which were there earlier also, but because of the different nature of the AI and semiconductor technologies, it is going to be much more difficult for imposing countries to have very successful export control regimes or technology denial regimes.
What a time it is for global technology competition. Like, as you mentioned so many examples today, it's both exciting and intriguing, I think, to see where we go from here. Arindam, we look forward to reading what you write on this further. I'm sure there's so much more to tease out here. But for today, we will stop here on futures for India, and at a positive note for what we can expect in the future. Thank you so much.
I will just leave it with one thought. We always think of India as a country that's been on the receiving end of export control regimes, or the targeted country as such, right? But after the 1998 nuclear blast, when India wanted to show itself as a responsible nuclear power, India also imposed its own export control lists to make sure that its exports are compliant and it can show itself as a responsible nuclear power. We did that even in the case of the biological weapons convention, the chemical weapons convention, etc. It's because we wanted to be known as a country which is responsible. So these export control regimes are instructive, not just as a targeted country, but also from the point of view of an imposing country, because India is developing technologically. We will be building technologies which will have widespread impact, and therefore it is important for India to also take lessons out of what really makes a credible export control regime.
So you're saying what started out as posturing has also helped us up our game?
Yes, I think it has helped us know how export control regimes can be circumvented, how it could be hazardous to the world, and then it helps us to also design our export control regimes, whatever they might be, or our participation in disarmament or non-proliferation sort of efforts in a way that is really fruitful.
Right. So lots of opportunity also here for countries that are on the receiving end of these denial regimes.
Right. Countries which have good R&D capabilities and economic wherewithal to be the leaders in technologies. Yeah.
Thank you, Arindam, for that final thought. We'll stop there. This has been a very insightful discussion for me because I am not very familiar with this topic and I've learned so much in the span of this podcast. I hope it has been the case for our listeners as well. Please go back and read Arindam's paper and we'll see you in the next episode. Thank you, Arindam.
Thank you, Shreya.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaInst or our website takshashila.org.in.